Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the third in a series of mini lectures on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. Today we're going to talk about style, and I like to talk about style. So at the end of the last mini lecture, I described Pip as a new kind of self, orphaned by history and therefore free to shape his own story. Today, I want to talk about the way he tells that story in a divided voice, for Pip is not one person, but two. He is Pip the child, terrorized by the violence of the adult world and fascinated by its mysteries, but this Pip's thoughts and feelings are reported to us by Pip the grown man, who remembers it all, but understands it now in a different way. The protagonist of Dickens's novel both experiences his story for the first time as a child and looks back on it as a grown man, profoundly changed by the experiences he's narrating. And this is the second contradiction in Great Expectations. But hang on, time out. Do you remember what the first contradiction was? Let's touch base there. The second contradiction is that the I of Dickens's first-person narration refers both to the protagonist and to the narrator. If you think about it, this means that the historical rupture between present and past not only separates Pip from his family or Victorian England from traditional Christianity, it's also internal to the protagonist. It separates Pip from himself, dividing his point of view between that of Pip the child and that of his adult self. The novel's achievement is that as these two gradually grow together and approach one another, the sense of rupture is healed. This particular combination of characters leads to the striking mixture of terror and hilarity in Dickens's style. These qualities appear, for example, when Pip goes back out onto the marshes at the start of Chapter 3, carrying stolen food to the convict Magwitch. Pip is feeling both guilty and afraid as he creeps out at dawn, and the description captures these emotions while rendering the scene itself with a sense of the absurd so vivid it almost seems surreal. The mist was heavier yet when I got out upon the marshes, so that instead of my running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. This was very disagreeable to a guilty mind. The gates and dikes and banks came bursting at me through the mist as if they cried as plainly as could be, "A boy with somebody else's pork pie! Stop him!" The cattle came upon me with like suddenness, staring out of their eyes and steaming out of their nostrils. "Holla, young thief!" One black ox with a white cravat on, who even had, to my awakened conscience, something of a clerical air, fixed me so obstinately with his eyes and moved his blunt head around in such an accusatory manner as I moved round, that I blubbered out to him, "I couldn't help it, sir. It wasn't for myself I took it." Upon which he put down his head, blew a cloud of smoke out of his nose, and vanished with a kick-up of his hind legs and a flourish of his tail. The effects of this description are, of course, anchored in its details. Running in a heavy fog does make things seem to loom up at you because they're so close before you can see them. So does driving in a heavy fog, for that matter. The narrator's description first emphasizes the subjective reversal that underlies this impression. Instead of my running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. You remember in Pride and Prejudice the way Austen shows Elizabeth projecting her feelings and judgments into the scene she beholds, Wickham's face, Darcy's estate, and finally the portrait. In Pip's morning dash through the fog, Dickens is making this subjective illusion explicit, but also ridiculous. And he does this by playing on the gap between Pip as narrator and Pip as protagonist. The conscious awareness of the reversal belongs to the adult narrator. The guilt and fear that inspire the actual perceptions are the child's. A fantasy of gates and dikes and banks accusing him intensifies these feelings, even as the accusation, "a boy with somebody else's pork pie," adds a note of hilarity that can only belong to the adult no longer terrorized by what he describes. This odd blend of tones is sustained right through the passage. The perception that a black ox with a triangular white patch on his chest might look like a minister dressed in black with a white cravat could well belong to the child. Certainly it expresses a child's sense of strangeness in the appearance of a preacher. But the phrasing, which places the cravat directly onto the ox, who seems to be wearing it, plays up the incongruity of the image with a deft verbal flourish, giving us once again a sense of the distance separating the amused adult speaker from the terrified child. The absurd address to the ox as "Sir" marks the moment when the transformation of beast into minister is complete in the guilty imagination of the child. The sentence that follows is sublime, for it does nothing but describe the completely bovine response of the black ox. Ox and minister have been so fused in the imagery of the description that the pronoun he, following hard upon the child's cry and the vivid perception that inspires it, makes the purely objective rendering of the ox, kicking up its heels and running away, into the most surreal moment of the passage. This moment, in which the ordinary reality of the scene seems like the least real thing about it, lets us feel once again the incongruous fusion that results from the child's sense of guilty terror being filtered through the sympathetic yet amused recollection of the adult. Evidently, the protagonist who breaks away from the past to name himself and tell his own story must also invent a new style in which such a story can be told. You remember I spoke last time about Dickens's New Covenant as a narrative contract. What we've been exploring this time are, well, the terms of the contract. They require the protagonist to be split off not only from the past, but also from himself, so that he can be at once narrator and protagonist. They also require a new style, one that plays constantly across the gap between the perspectives of the subject as character and the subject as narrator. This gap, internal to the first-person narration, is what I presented as the second contradiction of the New Covenant. And this contradiction is central, as we just now saw, to the specific combination of pathos and comedy in Dickens's style. But it is also central to the progress of the narrative, for as Pip grows and changes, moving steadily toward the end point of the story, the character is on his way to becoming the narrator. The gap between perspectives that creates the possibility of the novel's story and its style must close by the time the story ends. And if you recall, we saw something like this, once again, in Pride and Prejudice, where the conclusion unites Darcy and Elizabeth by closing the gap not just between their differing subjective points of view, but also the gap between their points of view and the omniscience of the narrator. It's like a vanishing point. As we saw with Elizabeth and Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, this process of growth leads through error to recognition, and recognition brings with it humiliation. Out of humiliation comes moral improvement. I'll describe this process in more detail in the mini-lectures that follow. But the differences between these stories will continue to be as striking and as important as the similarities. Pip grows into a single man, who is, if not in possession of a good fortune, then at least in prospect of one, yet he doesn't seem to be in want of a wife. There is a potential wife right there, growing up at his side throughout Volume 1, waiting patiently for him to recognize the story they might tell together. But that would be a tale about companionate marriage, and that story's already been told. Pip ends without a wife or family, as isolated as he began. What he has in place of a family is his story, an ending perhaps foreshadowed in his beginning, for there in the churchyard where he comes into conscious existence, Pip has no flesh and blood family. What he has, there on the headstones, is writing. To recap, Great Expectations presents itself as a transformation of the chosen son story from the Bible. At the same time, I argued, the transformation is so radical that the new narrative and its covenant sometimes look more like a nightmarish burlesque of the old story than an imitation of it. I think one reason the past seems so distant in this novel is because the narrative contract in Dickens does away with the father, and that's huge. In its place, he authorizes the son to choose himself. And so Pip is an orphan, isolated from the past. I think we can see in this isolation the price of a terrible freedom. Having no special place in the world, Pip is not only free to invent his own name and story, but required to do so. He must become his own narrator if he's to have a story at all. The last words of Volume 1, "The world lay spread before me," echo the famous close of Milton's Paradise Lost as Adam and Eve depart from Eden. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest. But Adam and Eve walked hand in hand, comforted by Providence. Pip walks alone. His story will not end in marriage. As the self-chosen son, he must learn to face the consequences of his choice. Next time, we'll step back and do some mapping of the action in Volume 1, and we'll talk about the way the plot is structured by a kind of vicious cycle of pity, guilt, shame, and ambition, a vicious cycle that threatens to take over Pip's story.